What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Severe MMA channel. This is the Severe Preview Show. Now, in case you don't know me, I'm Paul Browne. This is my maiden voyage at the steering wheel of the Severe channel, the Severe podcast. So what we're doing this week is the preview show, but there are no fights to preview. There's no real top-level MMA happening this week. And rather than let you guys go without something to listen to or something to watch, thought we'd do just a little picture painting of what exciting MMA bouts are coming up through the month of September. The plan going forward, as you guys will probably know if you've been listening to the channel regularly, is that we will be maybe chopping and changing things a little in who's on what shows. So I'm going to be taking part in the preview shows each week, and I will be joined at various times by the likes of Ian O'Neill and Sean Sheehan and other guests. But this week, obviously, as I said, there's no big cards happening. So I'm going to just fly solo today and paint the picture of what big fights are happening over the month of September. Now, there's quite a few really exciting ones, and there's a couple of really big cards happening, not least the UFC 306 card at the Sphere. We've got some Bellator events. We have some exciting Cage Warriors events. They've actually got 3 shows on through the month of September. So let's get into it. We'll run through it in kind of chronological order and see what fights are there to whet the appetite. I'm not going to really break down the fights per se this week, because maybe on fight week we'll be able to do each of those. We can look into them in a little bit more depth and maybe go into the nuts and bolts of how the fights might play out and do things like make picks. But today, as I said, just set the table and let you guys know what's coming up and see if we can get you a little bit excited. So first up, on September the 8th, so Saturday week, we have the UFC returning with a bang after having a week off. And on top of the card, we've got an interesting welterweight matchup between Gilbert Burns and Sean Brady. Burns ranked at 6th, Sean Brady ranked at 8th. Now, Sean Brady's a guy that has maybe flown under some people's radars as a potential contender or someone that can work their way upward and toward the title picture at some point in the near future, the very near future, in fact. But there is a bit of a logjam of contenders up there already, isn't there, with Shavkat Rakhmonov up there, and Belal Muhammad has just snuck his way into a title shot and managed to actually claim the belt off Leon Edwards, who's obviously still there in the mix as well. And you've got Ian Machado, Gary, Jack Della Maddalena. There's a lot of names crammed in there at the top of the division. Sean Brady, 16-1 at the moment, so he's got a very strong record and showing extreme promise. The only defeat he has came against Belal Muhammad, and now that Belal has won the title, maybe that's looked back on now a little bit more favourably. For me, I'm yet to be convinced about his capacity to go on forward and become a challenger at the top of the division, or maybe become a fighter who you would consider championship level. Let's look at his UFC wins to date. So he's picked up victories over Court McGee, Ismail Nordiev, Christian Aguilera. It gets a little bit tougher then. Jake Matthews, a decent fighter. Michael Chiesa. And then he picked up that win over Kelvin Gastelum in December when he bounced back from his defeat to Belal Muhammad. So there's a list of fighters there, a few that are well known, like the likes of Matthews, Chiesa and Gastelum, those last 3. He doesn't really have that flagship victory on his resume so far, and he's going to need a couple of those, I think, to really elevate himself into the title conversation, particularly with the level of talent that's there already. It's going to be very difficult for him. Now, he's got a big one in front of him in September in Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns, of course, has a big name, and he's fought some really tough guys at the top of the division. Gilbert is now 38 years old, and for me, he's on the slightly the downturn of his trajectory of his career. So, it's going to be very, very difficult for him. He's doing interviews this week talking about maybe returning for one more run at the title. I personally don't see that happening. Let's look. He lost his last 2 fights to Belal and then Jack Della Maddalena. So, guys that are coming up and maybe coming into their prime, and he's not really able to kind of keep up with some of those guys at the moment. In the last 3 years, his only wins have been against Neil Magny and Jorge Masvidal. So Masvidal, yeah, he's done and dusted now, and he's gone out of the UFC. I know he's talking about comebacks, but take that with a pinch of salt. Neil Magny, only ever really a gatekeeper. No one would ever really consider him a top 5 level welterweight. So yeah, Gilbert Burns can pick up wins against guys like that outside of the top tier, but I don't think he's a threat to anybody who's considering themselves worthy of having title aspirations. So this kind of is a test really for Sean Brady to see You know, can he get a name like Gilbert Burns on his resume? If he does, well, then maybe we start talking about him as possibly being worthy of competing for a place in the top 5. As I said, Burns is ranked at 6, so maybe if he picks up a victory over Burns, finds himself there, then we look upwards and see, you know, who's next. But yeah, if he falls short of this one, I mean, you could probably come to the conclusion that it's going to be very, very difficult for him in future to maybe make that jump, make that leap. As I said, he hasn't really beaten anyone at the top end of the division, so he really does need this victory. After that, we got the week later, September 15th, and that's a really, really busy night. There's a couple of really big cards going on there. So we've got the Bellator Champion Series taking place in London, and later that night we have UFC 306 taking place at the Sphere. Massive, massive card. They're putting a lot of eggs in this basket. They're really trying to give us the big sell on this one. But let's take a look at the two cards. We'll begin, I think, with the highlights that the Bellator card has for the London event. You've got a rematch between Fabian Edwards and Johnny Eblen for the middleweight title. Now, this fight happened last September, and Eblen stopped Edwards. Edwards came back and picked up a win in March over Aaron Jeffrey, and Johnny Eblen beat Impa Kasanganay at that PFL v Bellator card in February, if you'll remember. So both guys have had that one match since they met for the title. You know, it's a big ask for Fabian Edwards to come back and beat a guy like Johnny Eblen, who has just looked ridiculous so far. He's 15-0, and he looks like he's capable of going on a real run of defending his belt here. But you know, it's a great opportunity for Fabian Edwards. Let's see if he can make adjustments and get himself, you know, get his hands on that belt. Also on the card, there's an interesting lightweight matchup between Tim Wilde and Mark Diakiese. Wilde is coming off the back of a defeat in March to Manuel Souza, who is actually also on the card, but prior to that, he was on a 5-fight win streak. Wins over the decent fighters, decent UK level fighters, the likes of Charlie Leary and Saul Rogers. I mean, you know, not easy fights by any stretch of the imagination. Mark Diakiese's first appearance in Bellator since he left the UFC last November. He's still just 31 years old. I know he kind of flattered to deceive a little bit in the UFC. Some decisions didn't go his way, and you know, his results were sort of hit and miss. It was win one, lose one. He's got all the potential in the world. If he can he's one of those fighters. He has all of the right ingredients, but sometimes he just struggles to cook it properly, doesn't he? He's a fantastic striker, an exceptional wrestler, a brilliant athlete. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how he looks. This is a good showcase matchup for him. I believe he's going into the PFL lightweight tournament next year, if I'm not mistaken. Could be in there with Paul Hughes. You know, that could be a fight we might see in the tournament if they're both in the mix. So it's going to be interesting to see how he looks competing at this level and see how he settles, you know. So a strong top end to that Bellator card. There's a lot of Irish interest on that card too. Kieran Clark, Dara Kelly and Liam McCord are all in action, and all three of them have really tough tests in front of them. Kieran Clark's a guy that we've been screaming out for years in the Bellator shows here in Dublin, that maybe, you know, give him some really tougher tests and see where he's at. Kieran's unbeaten in his career so far, but maybe we want to see, you know, is he worthy of pushing in the direction of a Bellator title, or maybe in the direction of a PFL European tournament? You know, is he of that level? We need to find out. We need to ask questions of this young man. And he's in there against a Spaniard, Zebenzui Ruiz, who is 12-3, so a strong record. So let's see how he does here. Dara Kelly looked exceptional last time out in the Bellator show in Dublin. Again, another submission finish, and he's got a really interesting matchup against him. I'm going to try and pronounce this correctly. He's got Dmitry Hrytsenko, a Ukrainian fighter, 9-0, so a really strong record. Dara, I think, is 6-0, isn't he? So two unbeaten fighters going head to head. Someone's always got to go. Maybe it's a step up in competition again for Dara, we might see. So let's kind of get a real gauge of where he's at. He's looked sensational so far, and I think he's committed now to staying at 155 pounds going forward. That's what he told me at the media day for the Bellator Dublin show. And Leah McCourt, of course, going in there against the unbeaten Sarah Collins, who's 5-0. We haven't seen Leah in action in a while, so good to see her back. So plenty of Irish interest in that card. And as I mentioned now, on the same night, later that night, we're going to have the Sphere card, the UFC Sphere card. Couple of title fights on the card. The top end of the card looks really strong. The UFC have kind of front loaded that card a little bit. I think they're kind of banking on the Sphere element being the big selling point here, rather than packing it with names along the way they did UFC 300. They're not filtering, or they're not filling it up from top to bottom with championship level fighters or, you know, really experienced credential guys. They are, you know, they're celebrating Mexican Independence Day, so a lot of fighters of Latin descent on the card. But amongst the most well-known ones, obviously, we've got the main event, Sean O'Malley and Merab Dvalishvili. There's an interesting one just before the co-main between Grasso and Shevchenko. We have the long-awaited match between Brian Ortega and Diego Lopez. Now, this fight was supposed to take place on UFC 303. If you remember, it was the co-main event. And Ortega had real problems with making weight. I can't remember if he took this fight on short notice or not. I have that in my head that he may have taken it on just a few weeks' notice. But I believe the day before the weigh-ins, he contacted them. So he said he wouldn't be able to make... He contacted his opponents and said he wouldn't be able to make 145. And they kind of came to an agreement to do the fight at 155. And then he wasn't able to make that either. So he was out, and they pulled in Dan Ige on the day of the show. And the fight, I think, eventually took place at 165. So Lopez went on and picked up the win, and you know, he was very professional and he was very accommodating, I think, to Ortega. But they're deciding now that they're going to run this back. And this is a fight that it's a kind of fight that the UFC have been making a lot on their bigger cards lately. Ortega is ranked at 3. You know, he's been all the way up there and he's fought for the title against both Max and against Volkanovski. He's got a really high ranking spot. Diego Lopez is in 12th, and they've been making fights like this quite a bit over the last few months. If you think about the likes of Benoit Saint-Denis fighting the much higher ranked Dustin Poirier, we also saw the recent fight between Umar Nurmagomedov and Corey Sandhagen. So you got one fighter who's way up in the rankings, maybe ranked as the number one contender or thereabouts, you know, risking his place in the rankings to fight someone who's ranked maybe 10th or outside the top 10. It's happened quite a bit. We saw it just this weekend gone. Caio Borralho stepped in against Jared Cannonier. Borralho was ranked in 12th and Cannonier had that top 5 ranking, and now Borralho finds himself in that spot and looking upwards to see who he can target next in that top 5. I like this kind of risk taken from fighters, you know, defend, as Dustin Poirier says, you got to defend that spot, you know, it's your spot to defend. You can't just shy away from those tough matchups. You know, if the title fight isn't there and somebody is eyeing your spot in the ranking, you kind of owe them that opportunity. So I like the way they're making this one. Diego Lopez is a fighter that has been putting on some exciting fights. He's 4-1 in the UFC. Pardon me. The only loss came to Movsar Evloev, and I believe that was his debut, and he took it on short notice. It was 5 days' notice, yeah. So he came in, and you know, Evloev has been kind of beating everybody really. So a loss to him is one that you can look back on at short notice and say, okay, that's not too bad actually. In the grand scheme of things. He stepped up in competition. That last 2 victories, he took out Sadiq Youssef, and then that victory over Dan Ige where he looked well in control. He's on a 4-fight winning streak, and he's looked super impressive. And what's interesting about him is that he takes risks. You know, he gets a little bit wild, a little bit reckless. He'll dive on things. He's a really good grappler, which, you know, might be enough to make him able, or give him the opportunity to be able to hang with Brian Ortega. We all know Brian Ortega. He's always been renowned as an absolute jiu-jitsu phenom. At the highest level of mixed martial arts, pure jiu-jitsu, and I say this as a jiu-jitsu black belt, pure jiu-jitsu is not the best base to be relying on. It's an effective skill set, and it can get you to a very high level of mixed martial arts. But when you're starting to talk about title-worthy fighters, relying on it heavily isn't going to be the optimal way of getting your hands on the belt. So Brian Ortega, he's really, really dangerous when the fight hits the mat. But as we've seen, Diego Lopez, very competent grappler. He might be able to match fire with fire. And then it'll be a case of figuring out who can kind of get the better of the likes of, the grappling exchanges on the feet, the clinch work against the fence, the striking. That could be where this fight plays out. Since beating the Korean Zombie almost 4 years ago, Brian Ortega has only fought 3 times. So activity has been very, very low in comparison to Diego Lopez. And these are things that raise question marks for me when I see a fighter sort of lowering down his level in activity. He had that championship loss to Volkanovski, which was quite conclusive. And then he was 1-1 against Yair Rodriguez. So obviously in that first one, I think he picked up an injury, didn't it? It was in a shoulder injury. And then he submitted to Yair there in the rematch when they ran it back. That was his most recent fight. But if memory serves, he was actually losing. I think it was the first round or even the first 2 rounds, and then came back and pulled off that submission. And Yair Rodriguez is a fighter that you can do that to. I mean, you can be he can be looking good in a fight and then you can catch him, and he's very, very good, but again, he's not a fighter who is championship standard, I don't believe. So so this could be a matchup that gives Lopez that name on his on his resume, where he can point at that and say, "Yeah, I just beat the number 3 ranked guy." It's just that the timing could be right here. Again, on fight week, we'll get into breaking down the nuts and bolts of the fight, but that's how the match is kind of being set up, and that's why I believe it's going to be something that could have big consequences for the featherweight division coming out the other side of UFC 306. And obviously then at the top of the card, the big money fight is Sean O'Malley defending his title against Merab Dvalishvili. Someone, I can't remember who it was, compared this fight last week or pointed out that this was a very similar style of fight to the Bilal Muhammad Leon Edwards fight, So you've got one really intense pressure fighter who's just hungry for that belt, and then you've got one slick, stylish striker. So we've seen matchups like that over the years, haven't we? We've seen Khabib against Conor McGregor, and we've seen, as I just mentioned there, the Bilal and Leon one. They don't always play out the same, so it's a difficult one to read. All we can do is look at each fighter's record and kind of make our guesses from there. Sugar's 18-1 right now, so his first 7 fights in the UFC, he kind of had a relatively comfortable run of things. He was fighting guys that were, not remotely near the top end of the rankings, and he was just piecing them up and looking stylistic. And he was allowed his opportunity to grow into the fighter he is today. Then he was thrown into the mix. At the top of the division, there was a couple of guys who had the belt, or, there was a couple of really championship level fighters. Petr Yan had recently lost the belt to Aljamain Sterling, and then, lost to him in the rematch a little bit more conclusively. So what they did was they threw Sean O'Malley in against him. And that was quite the leap in level of competition at the time. And a lot of people were thinking, that Jan was just going to outclass him entirely and smash him. But he managed to get the victory via split decision. And I know, you can go back and watch that and you can absolutely make a case that Jan won a couple of those rounds. It was super, super close. But the fact remains that Sean O'Malley came out on top. He got the hand raised, and he looked excellent in that fight, I have to say. What I really liked about his game was that he made some adjustments when he went on then to fight Aljamain Sterling for the belt. I did a video of this on my own YouTube channel, and what it is basically how he kind of approached the fight a little bit differently, because when you're moving from fighting for 3 rounds and then you're moving into a 5-round title fight against a higher quality of opponent, you just cannot afford to be as aggressive or as reckless in the way that you fight. You're going to get caught if you're overcommitting on certain shots. So he managed his energy levels, he managed his distance a hell of a lot better against Aljamain Sterling, and yeah, he got that finish. I think it was in the second round. He stopped him, he knocked him out, and finished him on the ground. So the step up in competition, he overcame those big 2 hurdles. Now, when he had his first title defense, it was against Marlon Vera, and that was a bit of a gimme, wasn't it? They just handed that to him because he had that was the only loss on his record, and realistically it was because of an injury. It was a result of his foot getting injured, and Marlon Vera was able to get on top of him and finish him. So they gave him the opportunity, they gave Marlon Vera the opportunity to skip the queue a little bit. He hadn't really done enough to earn a title shot ahead of some of the other guys, Merab Dvalishvili included. But they gave him the opportunity regardless. And it was a good showcase for O'Malley. He got to showcase his skills. He pieced him up over the 5 rounds. He really, really did. One interesting thing at the end was that we got to see, right at the death of the fight, a body shot landed from Marlon Vera, and we got to see O'Malley in a little bit of trouble. And you know, when the buzzer went at the end, or the air horn went, he had to sit down, didn't he? He was really in trouble. So it looked like, hey, if that happened and there was still like 60 seconds left on the clock, he might have been there to be finished. We don't know, but his resilience, his physical resilience, you know, it's been questioned a few times. I've heard Sean Sheehan talking about it. You know, the fact that he's injured himself a couple of times seriously in fights with his legs and stuff like that. And then, you know, can he take, you know, can he get through a 5-round war where he's taken a lot of punishment? Merab Dvalishvili is going to bring that to him. You talk about strength of record. Let's look at how Merab has got on. He lost his opening 2 fights in the UFC, but he's gone on a 10-fight winning streak since. He's brought an insane pressure, an insane level of cardio, and he is certainly aggressive and reckless, and he comes in to try and do damage to his opponents. His last 3 wins against champions, former champions, Jose Aldo, Piotr Jan and Henry Cejudo. So the questions over whether he can hang with championship level fighters, they've been more than answered. And, you know, coming into this fight, he will be absolutely brimming with confidence that he can get the job done against O'Malley. For me, the big question mark is, can O'Malley continue to do what he's been doing against someone like Merab Dvalishvili? So that for me is the biggest question there, and it's a fight I can't wait to see. So moving past the middle of the month, we go on towards September 20th and 21st. We've got 2 Cage Warriors events on that weekend, and there's just 2 title fights on these that I wanted to highlight. One with severe Irish interest, obviously. September 20th, we have James Sheehan, Jimbo Slice, my teammate, my friend. He's defending his welterweight title against the former welterweight champion, Yanis Bekar. So Jimbo is 7-1 in the promotion since his defeat to Ian Gary way back in 2019. So over the last 5 years, he's looked exceptional. The only defeat along the way was that one to Oban Elliott, who has now gone on to join the UFC, and he's unbeaten in the UFC. So we're seeing, you know, that's the level that Jimbo's at. The only guys that have beaten him there, Matt Bonner when he was very, very young in his career, and then Ian Gary and Oban Elliott, who've gone on and started, you know, making waves in the UFC. So Jimbo cannot be far away from that level. And he's really, really improved he's rounded out his skill set, and he's just become a more experienced fighter. He's learned some good lessons over some difficult fights over the last couple of years. He won the title in April, an absolute war, a barn burner. He submitted Daniel Conrad after a difficult start. I believe he lost the first 2 rounds, and, you know, he was caught, he was smashed up, but he was able to just maintain his composure, and it was his fundamentals paid off in the end. He just looked a tidier, more efficient fighter, and Conrad sort of threw the kitchen sink at him and just couldn't put him away, and then just couldn't hang with him going forward. Jimbo is, I can tell you right now, he's ridiculously physically strong, and he just fights at a nice tempo. You know, he is not going to get tired. If you need him to do 10 rounds, he can do 10 rounds. So these 5-round fights are very, very interesting. The guy he's in here against, Yanis Bekar 2-0 in Cage Warriors, and then what he did was he relinquished the belt to go off and fight in the latest season of Tough. Now, he was knocked out after 20 seconds in that first fight. I think it was with Robert Valentin, of course, who we just saw fight last weekend. So, you know, he's back in Cage Warriors, essentially return him to try and claim back his belt, which he never lost. We've seen him look very impressive. I've only seen him in Cage Warriors. I didn't see his fight in Brave or any of the fights he had before that. But in Cage Warriors, he's looked really, really good. He's taken out 2 guys, championship level guys in Cage Warriors. He beat Carlo Pedersoli Jr., who I know the guys behind the scenes at Cage Warriors were, you know, they were very interested in seeing him fighting in and around, challenging for the title prior to that fight. I think that result came as a bit of a surprise. And then O'Malley Browne, of course, who James Sheehan has beaten, but O'Malley has been knocking people out, highlight reel knocking people out over the course of his Cage Warriors career. And when he stepped in to fight against Yanis Bekar the first time for that title, it was when the title was vacant, and everyone was kind of looking at O'Malley Browne as, okay, this is going to be the guy that's going to win the title, this is his moment. And he came out aggressively and he was pouring it on, and Yanis Bekar knocked him out with that first punch. So he's clearly got power. Bekar's record is 9-2, and he's got 8 knockouts on that ledger. So He's a fighter that brings serious jeopardy into the mix. He brings a threat, much like the guy that James Sheehan beat to win the title. He might have to go through, if he wants to defend his belt this time, he might have to go through the trenches to do it. He might have to go through an absolute war, and his chin is most likely going to be tested. So it's always an interesting clash of styles when you get that sort of tidy, efficient, resilient, strong guy, maybe a solid grappler, coming in against a guy who just has the potential to spark you out at any given moment. Again, a 5-round fight, so it might be just a case of weathering a storm and seeing if he can get through the onslaught of Bakar, who's going to be very, very dangerous, particularly in those first 2 rounds. The following night then, you've got Cage Warriors 178. So the 2 events are taking place back-to-back Friday, Saturday nights. The James Sheehan one, interestingly, is behind closed doors. It's more or less, it's at an unplugged event in Manchester. So it's strange for me to be defending your world title in a quiet room. It's going to be a bit eerie. But the following night, expect a sold-out BEC Arena in Manchester. Andy Clamp defends his light heavyweight title against James Webb, of course, a fighter with plenty of Irish interest, trains in Team KF here in Dublin. Clamp won the belt in March when he knocked out Matty Byfield. He is 13-2 and he's got 12 finishes on his record. I met Clamp last year when I was working with Cage Warriors. Lovely, lovely guy. Seriously dangerous fighter and an absolute gorilla of a man. So yeah, he's an interesting, exciting fighter to watch. Again, much like Yanis Bakar, he has the potential to finish a fight at any given moment. And he's in there against James Webb, former middleweight champion James Webb. Lost the title, and then he's had mixed results maybe since. Moved up to light heavyweight, and his last fight was against Adam, you'll pronounce this correctly, Biaganski. That was just last month, so it's very, very recent. And he did look very, very good. He looked like he had really beefed up, and he carried the weight well. He looked solid. He looked dominant really in that fight. So he's earned himself a light heavyweight title shot. So we could see, there's a possibility we might see another Cage Warriors title coming back to Team KF here in Dublin. And then to round out the month, a week later, September 28th, we've got a UFC fight night. And for me, there's 2 fights on that card that are very, very interesting between name value and maybe implications on the top end of the division. So we've got Renato Moicano taking on Benoit Saint-Denis in the lightweight division. And we have Nasruddin Imavov taking on Brendan Allen in the middleweight division. I'll talk about the Moicano and Saint-Denis fight first. So both of these guys, they're ranked right beside each other in the division. They're ranked 11th and 12th. So realistically, what's going to happen is, come the other side of this fight, the rankings are going to be pretty much the same. Either they'll be exactly the same where they are, or they'll just be reversed. They'll still be taking up 11 and 12. So it's not going to have a massive immediate impact on, the actual standings for all the other fighters in the division. But a win for either guy here over a name value opponent, because both of these guys are kind of well known now. It could definitely do wonders for their ability to get a big fight going forward after that. We, of course, saw Benoit Saint-Denis fight, as I mentioned earlier, against Dustin Poirier at UFC 299 back in March. And again, Poirier gave him that opportunity. He was on a 5-fight win streak. Before that, he was really just knocking guys clean out, and he was looking exceptional. Again, I made a video on him, breaking him down in the run-up to that fight on my own YouTube channel. You should go check it out. But yeah, he had been sort of just tearing up the division before that. And he was ranked, I think, 12th at the time, and Poirier was ranked 2nd or 3rd, and Poirier gave him the shot. Ultimately, he failed, but in that first round, he was really putting a beating on Poirier. Staff in the lead up to the fight, I think, and we could see that he visibly tired going into that second round. And it cost him. Poirier knocked him out with that right hook, and that was all she wrote. But now that he's fought someone like Poirier, people obviously know who he is, so that's really good for his career going forward. Likewise, Renato Moicano, he's been cutting a hell of a lot of really good promos, and he's all over social media, clips of his podcast. People know who he is now. He's on a 3-fight win streak himself. Decent fighters he's beaten as well, the likes of Brad Riddell, Drew Dober, Jalen Turner over his last 3 fights. So he, his form has been pretty good. The Jalen Turner one was interesting because that was where Jalen Turner had that potential walk-off knockout, and he just sort of led him back into the fight, and then Moicano came back and won the fight. So As I said, both guys are sort of known now, so a victory over the other, yeah, it's going to mean something for them going forward. As I said, they're not going to change places in the rankings, but certainly it's going to be a good name to have on their record, and it'll be interesting to see what fight it can get them after that. And then the other fight on that card, one that will certainly have a little bit more implication on the top end of the division, or can do anyway. Nasruddin Imavov, who's ranked 4th in the middleweight division, and he's fighting Brendan Allen, who's ranked 8th. Now, at the top of the middleweight division, just above Imavov, we have Whitaker, Adesanya and Strickland. They're ranked 1, 2, 3. And of course, Dricus du Plessis is the champion. So the guys who are ranked 1 through 3, so Bobby Knuckles, Izzy and Sean Strickland, all three of them are sort of at that point in their career where they may or may not, I'll be surprised if any of them can really get their hands on the belt and then, have another run as champion. Let's be real. So all three of them are sort of, well, Strickland, we were all surprised he got to the belt at all. Does anyone really see him doing it a second time? It's difficult, It's not to say he can't, but he's not a guy that you would look at as a potential long-term champion. Israel Adesanya, I think it's quite clear he's kind of just starting now on the downward trajectory of his career. He had a great run as champ. And then, you've got Bobby Knuckles, who was champ once and then has sort of just faltered in and around the top. But he's been looking really good against other contenders. So difficult to see any of them getting to the title, whereas we look slightly outside of that. There's the likes of Imavov at 4th and now Caio Borralho at 5th, who are up and coming and hungry, and Brendan Allen a few slots below. These are guys that are looking like the next wave. It's going to be interesting to see a couple of these guys fight each other and see who can maybe emerge from that pack looking the best. And then one of those guys is probably going to get the opportunity to take out one of the ranked 1, 2, 3 superstars that I just mentioned. So yeah, there's certainly a lot up for grabs here. Think about Imavov's wins. He's got wins over the names like, Edmund Shabazian, who's not really proven much of a problem for any of his opponents lately. But then guys like Joaquin Buckley, Roman Dolidze and Jared Cannonier. So he's beaten some decent quality names. He's looking to make that next step now. Brendan Allen's on a 7-fight winning streak. 5 of those wins have been rear naked chokes. I spoke earlier about jiu-jitsu is a good weapon to beat fighters at a certain level. I don't know if he's going to be able to continue doing things like that to the guys at the very, very top of the division. It's difficult to know. I suppose there's one way to find out. It's to see which one of them emerges here and then maybe give them a test slightly higher. Both of them are just 28 years old. So for middleweights, they're only just coming into their prime, and the next couple of years are going to be very, very interesting in that division. And it has needed a bit of spicing up, hasn't it? So some interesting times ahead at 185 pounds. Right, guys, that'll do us for today. I won't keep you any longer. Hopefully, I've got you a little bit excited about some of those fights that are coming up in September. And as I said, the preview show each week, what we're going to do is we'll sit down, maybe 2 or 3 of us at a time, and we'll discuss these fights and the whole fight cards really in a bit more depth. Maybe give you an idea of what we think is actually going to happen in some of the fights, how they're going to play out. I'm really looking forward to it over the next while. Get into the nitty gritty of some of the huge fights that we have in September. But at least now we've painted the picture and we know there's some big ones coming, and hope you enjoyed the podcast, and I will see you next time. Take it easy.